Well, good evening to everyone who is joining us tonight. We welcome you to another session of the Lived Black Experience. Tonight, we are excited to be introducing you to our new, and we're very excited about our partnership with Brightside Book Shop for a Lived Black Experience book series. We were going to be joined initially by a representative from the bookshop, Miss Corey Cusker. Unfortunately, she was unable to join us this evening, but we are very thrilled to have Brightside partnering with us for this project. Brightside Book Shop was purchased in 2017 by longtime Flagstaff locals Annette Avery and husband and wife duo Ben Schaefer and Lisa Lamberson, with the intention of developing a dynamic and versatile space for community interaction and events. The owners of Brightside Bookshop have taken it upon themselves to uphold the mantle of a community hub for every resident and traveler looking for a place to find quality products, books, events, and regional information. Located in the heart of downtown Flagstaff, Brightside Bookshop is a must-see destination for anyone looking to immerse themselves deeper into the soul of Flagstaff. Brightside Books, in partnering with us, is enabling for the local purchase of books. So it's a wonderful opportunity for folks to buy local and support the local economy of Flagstaff. They are also providing part of the proceeds directly to the Live Black Experience project. So we encourage you to purchase the books for the series directly from Brightside. It's also important because they are serving with us as what we like to call accomplices in this work of educating the community, sharing out the voice of the community, and telling a story that is often untold within our community. So we are very, again, excited to be sharing in this project with them. We thank them for their partnership, and we look forward to those of you who will join us in our readings, joining us as we launch into our series tonight. Tonight, our discussion is going to focus on the Lived Black Experience Books of the Month. We're going to have an overview by Dr. Wendy Rountree and a discussion with Miss Maya Guthrie as well on the importance of these books that we're talking about. So to start, we're going to hear from Dr. Wendy Rountree. Dr. Wendy Rountree is Director of and Professor in the Ethnic Studies program at Northern Arizona University. Her expertise is in 20th century American literature, 20th century ethnic American literature with an emphasis in African American literature, including contemporary African American literature, and 20th century ethnic American drama. She has published book chapters, book reviews, journal articles, and 2 academic books, Just Us Girls, the contemporary African American young adult novel, and The Boys Club, male protagonists in contemporary African American young adult literature, and a young adult novel, Lost Soul. Dr. Rountree is a graduate of UNC-Chapel Hill, East Carolina University, and the University of Cincinnati, and has worked previously at Salisbury University and North Carolina Central University. Welcome, Dr. Rountree.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that introduction. I'm always excited when I have the opportunity to talk about books and literature. So really what I'm going to try to do in a nutshell is basically take us down the literary history road for African American literature. And to begin with, I want to stress that the role of history is critical and crucial, not only to the writers of African American literature, but also the readers. So you always want to pay attention to the settings, but also the time in which the writers are creating their particular craft or their particular text. So one of the first things that we talk about when we talk about African American literary history is we go back to vernacular tradition, or the idea of orality, coming from the west coast of Africa. And we know because of those who have been enslaved going through the Middle Passage and entering into North America in particular, that African American vernacular traditions has derived from there. So we have many characteristics that will show up in African American literature that comes from this particular aspect. So for example, we have key figures that will show up in the literature, such as the African griot. To be simplistic, it's the idea of the storyteller. Everyone who has visited or attended a family reunion has that aunt, that uncle who holds the stories, right, of the family. That is the quote unquote African griot of your family. Also, the notion of the bad man, the trickster, talking about a Nazi, Brer Rabbit. Characteristics that we want to look out for as well: rhythm, repetition, call and response, dialect and slang are also characteristics that will show up in African American literature. And when we talk about the genres, we talk about, of course, more contemporary rap. We think about the Negro spirituals, gospel, folk tales, ballads, and of course, blues music, among others. Now, as we move forward in down the track of literary history, we know that the slave narratives by scholars have been placed as the foundation of the African American literature. And within that, we have to think about the power of those slave narratives. Oftentimes during that time period, it was the notion that writing would equal power and the idea of freedom, and also basically signifying that you were a human being. And so within the slave narratives, we of course have a key theme in African American literature of the idea of the quest for freedom, but also the quest for literacy. Over time, those will change, again, based on that time period, whether we're talking about the notion of segregation, separate but equal, etc. But from our book list, we have examples from this time period that are going to be the Underground Railroad. Also, they were her property, white women as slave owners, and of course, the Civil War in Arizona. So as we move through this, we know that, of course, we have the emancipation. And so there are three key amendments that are key in the history of African American lives, but then also in the literature: the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th. Just brief reminders that abolishment of slavery for the 13th Amendment will guarantee all citizens of the United States equal rights and privileges for the 14th Amendment. And then we have the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote to all citizens of the United States. During this time period, we know that we have the rise of the Buffalo Soldiers. And so we will have a particular text, The Buffalo Soldiers, a narrative by William Leckie. Now we move forward into time, and we know that we move through Reconstruction. This was a time for advancements, particularly in the South, for African Americans. We have people who are in the legislatures, etc. But we also know that it came to an end. And in doing so, we know that leads to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and terror throughout the American South for African Americans. One of the key legislations that was passed from the Supreme Court, I think that most people are aware of, is Plessy versus Ferguson. This is a key ruling for the Supreme Court, passed in 1896. It basically legalized segregation, which leads into Jim Crow laws. So from our book list, one of the texts that will be very prominent within this time period will be The Morrow of Tradition by Charles Chesnutt. And then also leading a little bit later, but still answering back to this time period, will be The Miseducation of the Negro by Carter G. Woodson. As we move forward, we know because of certain key elements of oppression, disenfranchisement, lynching, sharecropping, segregation, you'll see many, in particular, young African Americans decide to leave the South for the North, but also for the West. And because of those particular ones, some of the numbers, just to kind of highlight that mass exodus. For example, for Chicago, you had, before the Great Migration, typically 1910 to 1920, 44,000 African Americans present in the city. After that decade, it jumps to around 109,400. So you can see there are reasons why the young in particular are leaving the South, wanting more opportunities. Now, the Great Migration is extremely important because it leads to something that's extremely powerful during the African American literary history, which will be the Harlem Renaissance. Because we have this active movement from young African Americans in particular, they're bringing new ideas. Yes, some from the South, but new ideas that are going to culminate during the Harlem Renaissance. Now, during the Harlem Renaissance, it's definitely debatable, but typically we talk about the 1900s to about 1940 for the Harlem Renaissance. This is an amazing time for African American excellence, Black excellence. We're talking about not only the development of new ideas of the new Negro with Alain Locke, but then also the development of sculptures, the idea of the essay and the powerful books and novels that are coming from this, and of course the poetry. What is key about the Harlem Renaissance, though, is this idea that African American literature has agency. I would make the argument it always has had agency. But in this particular one, it's showing, or the thought was, that the cultural products would show the power of African Americans and their creativity and how they can contribute to America at large. And that they should no longer, and this is very key, no longer be treated as second-class citizens. Now, all things, of course, that are positive and wonderful and good, some of the books that we'll talk about, let's, for example, Their Eyes Are Watching God, which comes towards the end of the Harlem Renaissance, they come to an end. We're, again, looking at history. There's the crash of 1929 that leads to the Great Depression. And what's the first to go whenever the government, the state, whatever, is having a budget crunch? The arts. And so we definitely see then, it doesn't end automatically, but we start to see a decline in the Harlem Renaissance production from its particular writers. Now, an interesting transition, different people will call it the rise of the protest novel, etc., will come during this time period leading into about 1960. Some of the examples in this, for example, would be Native Son, which is on our book list. A powerful novel, first to be on the U.S. book list for an African American author, but also it becomes very significant in African American literary history because it's considered the first true urban novel from African Americans. So remember, we've been talking about slavery, segregation, the South, but again, because of that movement from the Great Migration and of course the rise of the Harlem Renaissance, we see this opening. Just moving a little bit further with 1952, we have Invisible Man, another book on the list. A matter of fact, this was probably one of the first books that truly affected me when I was thinking about the ideas of W.E.B. Du Bois's double consciousness and thinking about what does it mean to be Black in America. And this was extremely powerful text, but also one that is thought as more of part of that, not only protest, but more so integrationist timeline. Why do I bring this up? Because next we have this movement where we call it the Black Arts Movement. And you'll see a rejection of Ralph Ellison and the thoughts of integration by another new generation, young people. And you'll see more people who will embrace, ironically, some of the more direct elements that we saw previously in Native Son. But what's key about this is that we also see the establishment of the Black aesthetic, a way that African Americans are basically saying, this is how you are going to analyze us and our cultural products. We are dictating this. This is also the rise of the time period when we will see basically people saying that, I am going to say what I will be called, whether it's Afro-American, Black, etc. So it's a natural hair is embraced. It's a powerful, powerful time period. So also one of the basic mottos that is coming out of this time period is that all Black art should be written by, for, and of Black people. So you can see this kind of embracing of empowerment that's going on. And this is extremely important to the lived experience of African Americans. So as we're about to leave this particular time period, about 1960, 1970, 75, you'll see that not only will we have a new way of analyzing texts, African American texts that are derived from African American culture and also African culture, we'll also see Black determination that's coming out of this time period. And personally, I think some of the more provocative works are coming out of African American literature during this time. An example would be The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. So moving into the more contemporary time period, I would say late 20th century into the early part of the 21st century, where we are now, we see so many historical changes that are taking place. We see a rise of a larger African American middle class. We see people who are catering, I should say, industries, whether we're talking about the publishing industry, that are catering more towards African Americans. And we see the movement, of course, of Black studies in colleges. We see more access to colleges, etc., for African Americans. And this definitely plays out also in the literature. Some of the key trends that derived in this time period, but also are still present, are the following. So we start to see something that maybe we might have seen something that might have been seen as more of in the box for African Americans during the Black Arts Movement. We now see the rise of multiplicity of African American identities. So we're talking about taking into account not only, regionally where you're from, but then also where you were immigrants, okay? Instead of part of the shared history of slavery. Also sexual identity. All of these start to come into play in the literatures and the writers that are coming into this more contemporary time period. Some examples would be The Yellow House by Sarah Broom, Monster, one of my favorites. That's one of my areas. It's a young adult novel by Walter Dean Myers. Between the World and Me by Coates as well. So we see that developing. We also see the development of renewed interest in slavery. That means a reimagining. We're really talking about the psychological impacts for African Americans in this horrible institution coming from African American writers who have researched and also used, of course, experiences from their own family. So it's not on our book list, but probably most people recognize Beloved by Toni Morrison. But I wanted us to go out of the box a little bit and look at something slightly more I shouldn't say more experimental, but just as experimental, but possibly less known, Family by J. California Cooper. You also see the rise of African American women writers. If you notice, I was very conscious to try to bring in writers who were women as well. But in the mid 20th century, you definitely had more of the idea that the African American male experience was the African American experience. What you start to see in the 70s and into the 80s, you see that rise of the African American woman's perspective as well. And some of the representatives, or two of the representatives from our book list, would be I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou and Kindred by Octavia Butler. We also have the development, because of the rise of the number of African American scholars in institutions of higher education, we see that African American scholars begin to use different aspects from, guess what, vernacular tradition to help create literary theory, ways, again, of how we can analyze text. So we have the Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s with The Signifying Monkey. We have Houston Baker Jr., and we have many, many more that are coming out during this time period. And then, of course, one of the most exciting things, I think, as well, we have the influence then of these scholars and of African American literary scholarship. What does that mean? It means then we start expanding the canon. So we start to see graphic novels. In more contemporary times, I would say. We start to see the development and writing of Afrofuturism as well. And so some of the texts from our book list that speak to a more contemporary time period would be The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. Of course, I wanted to include former President Barack Obama, A Promised Land, which was released very recently. The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which speaks to a history that oftentimes African Americans, we might not know, or the world might not know, and it needs to be exposed. Brainwashed, Challenging the Myths of Black Inferiority by Tom Burrell, and of course, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. This is by Isabel Wilkerson. So this was basically African American literary history in a nutshell. And as you can see, I was trying to make sure that we have representative texts from each one of these particular time periods, because they are actually not only speak to the lived experience of African Americans during those time periods, but they still speak to us today and the consequences and the lived experiences that many of us are still having to maneuver and negotiate around. Thank you. I'm not sure if we're taking any questions now or if we're waiting for Ms. Guthrie.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rountree. Sorry for that brief pause. We were getting some stuff ready in the background, but we so appreciate that introduction to the books that were selected, some of the history, and all of that you covered during your presentation. We will have some questions coming up during a Q&A period towards the end of the session, and I see that we're getting some questions, some really good questions in right now, so we look forward to getting to that. Up next, we are going to hear from Miss Maya Guthrie, and she's going to be talking about her perspective as a young Black woman on the importance of examining African American literature, her take on why we're doing this series, and anything else that she will share with us this evening. Miss Guthrie is studying literature and Spanish at NAU, and she is the Community Service Chair for the Black Student Union at NAU. Though she is a huge nerd when it comes to all things English related, she also enjoys playing her viola and baking. She is extremely excited to join the dialogue about these books, and she eagerly awaits the lessons to be learned and the wisdom to be gained through this ongoing conversation. Welcome.
Thank you again for inviting me to be part of this. I'm so excited to be here. And thank you to Dr. Rountree for giving us such an in-depth explanation of the books. I really appreciate that. I've read some of the books on our list, but not all of them. These are the kinds of texts that I find that I return to time and time again of the ones that I've read. Yeah, so I'd like to first start a little bit talking about why these texts are so important. So for me personally, it's hard for me to find a truly unadulterated Black female perspective in other forms of media that aren't created by that demographic of people, right? On television, I know we've seen 1,000 times the sassy Black girl or the loud Black girl. And all of those things are really the product of racial stereotyping. And it's hard for me to find myself or my experiences accurately reflected in those those forms of media. As a whole, literature interests and captivates me because it provides crucial insight into my own humanity and the humanity of others. And so by reading a text, I can learn something about myself, but I can also learn something about the author who wrote it, the experiences of the people that are supposed to be reflected in the text, whether those are like fictional or non-fictional experiences. And in doing so, just learn a little bit more about my humanity. For instance, when I was in high school, so I grew up more or less in Flagstaff, and I attended Northland Preparatory Academy here. And I was one of the few Black students there. And I wouldn't have had the vocabulary to describe the feeling that I had kind of persisted throughout my high school experience. But now I would definitely describe that as double consciousness, right? This feeling that I'm part of this community, but something about who I am innately as a person contradicts what it means to be part of that community. So in that case, so in this instance, even though I was in the same classes and did the same extracurriculars as my white counterparts, I still was different from them because of my race. And it wasn't until I read Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison that I learned the term double consciousness and truly understood and appreciated what that meant. And finally, after reading that, it was like an aha moment, because I finally had the vocabulary to speak what I had been feeling. And then also, when I tried to describe my experience to other people, I had something concrete to point them to. It so that I think that is one of the true powers of literature. Um, Dr. Rountree talked a little bit about um, like the slave narrative and how that's kind of a foundational moment in Black literature as a whole. And that's something that I think about a lot because, in many ways, we have not escaped that part of our history. In many ways, we're still in bondage. And revisiting some of those seminal texts, like Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl or Frederick Douglass's autobiography, those aren't on our book list, but they're still great and foundational and amazing. Um, Revisiting those texts that were written hundreds of years ago, I learned something new every single time. I learned something about resiliency, what it means to be Black in America, and thinking about that in a more modern context too. I think about the ways that we're still in bondage, like literally with mass incarceration, redlining, all those kinds of things, but then also culturally, spiritually. Um, yeah, and I think, I don't know, I'm just excited to launch into this dialogue because there are so many ways that we can interpret some of these books. For instance, Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. That's a text that personally I've read it 2 or 3 times and I have some difficulty with it, because Zora Neale Hurston, as an individual, like she was an anthropologist and a luminary and an activist, and not, I feel like none of that is really reflected in her work because, well, not none of that, but let me rephrase. I feel that those aspects are not as well represented in that particular work because the main character is a woman, but her self-actualization hinges on her relationships with men. Um, but I've read that text multiple times, and every time I learn something different. The way that that text was kind of buried, and it took Alice Walker to revitalize it. I think speaks to real world sexism and misogynoir. I don't know. I'm kind of rambling now, but I think that these books are so crucial for understanding ourselves and each other.
Thank you so much, Maya. And I think you hit the nail right on the head with so much of what you said. And in talking about one of the first books that we'll be reviewing during a session is going to be Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. And so we'll dive more into that conversation. But today, in launching this, I think we'll also dive a little bit more into some of the things that you talked about there in terms of why the book is so important, why it took another author revitalizing the interest in her work to re-centralize her as such an important figure in African American literature, and a lot more that we're going to get into.
Can I say one thing?
Absolutely.
Oh, thanks. I just want to say, Maya, when you talked about Invisible Man, it made me not feel as old. That you were also so impacted by it, and that you really were able to say, got it. This is what it means to be Black in America, and that really be able to articulate it. So that was a wonderful moment. I really was able to say yes.
I'm so glad. Yeah, I've read that probably twice now, once for class and then once like just for leisure. And I don't know, some of those scenes, I'm sure we'll talk about this months down the line when it's time to talk about that book, but some of those scenes are just still so captivating to me.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much for your fantastic introductions to the series and why it's so important. Right now, we're going to share a video from Brightside Books and sharing why they have partnered with us in this series. Yeah, unfortunately, we may be having some difficulties, but we will certainly share the link to this video for everyone to be able to view it and see why they found it so important to partner with us as part of this program. So we will get that link shared out for you shortly. And part of what we are so encouraged by is the fact that Brightside Books did see the importance of this work that we're doing as part of the Live Black Experience project. They were excited to partner with us and to share in this experience, and the importance of having a literary partner who's willing to carry these books as part of this series is so important. And maybe that will be the first question that we jump into, is just why it's so important to have literary representation, to be able to see these books on shelves and know that they're available. We know that so often books that focus on African American literature, books by Black authors, are so often not widely available. They tend to be in a very small section of a broader bookshop, or kind of relegated to Black-owned bookshops, or just not as widely or mainstream available. So I'd like to ask you both just your thoughts on why it's so important to have this sort of literary representation. And I'll start with you, Maya, Ms. Guthrie, and then we'll go to Dr. Rountree.
Sure. I think that it's kind of an interesting question. So I think that on one hand, literature offers us, it's a unique medium, so you're engaging with the story in a completely different way. It draws on your imagination and forces you to really be immersed in the story, right? Like I can turn on a movie, and there's merit in other forms of media, but I think that reading a book can be so much more intimate than simply watching a movie, because you have to do all the legwork yourself, right? You have to bring the characters, the story, all of those things, the prose, to life yourself. And I think visibility is super important, because it can be so intimidating to walk into a bookstore knowing that you want to read more by authors of color or maybe Black female authors, and not knowing where to start. At most, like large bookstores like Barnes and Noble, they'll have like little end caps, where you can find all the Harry Potter books or all the YA books that are mystery or whatever. And they do that so that casual readers can come in and just grab whatever seems interesting to them. And if we don't have that same visibility for Black literature, then it's much harder for the casual reader to get into those things. I don't know. I think that it's really cool that Brightside Book Shop has partnered with us on this for that very reason.
Well, I echo the same sentiments. For me, one of my areas, I think I mentioned it earlier, of research is African American children's and young adult literature. And it's due to this, a lack of representation. I've talked about it before. Growing up, I loved Judy Blume, Beverly Cleary. I read. Eventually, I realized that, okay, I kind of understand. I love the stories. I understand them. However, the characters don't look like me. They are not necessarily experiencing the same sensation of maybe alienation when I'm the only African American kid in the class. And everyone turns to me when they say the N word from Huckleberry Finn. Okay. So I started trying to find more of those writers because representation matters. That's why you have so many different groups seeking that, whether it's on the screen or on the bookshelves. And so one of the things for me is that this is important, but also I think it's also our responsibility, whether it means going to the bookstore and buying these texts, okay? Sales and the money matters, but also for us to start creating these texts for ourselves as well. And for me, from the African American children's and young adult literature perspective, that was one of the reasons why I wanted to enter into that space, to really try to open it up for more representation. The number of texts published by African Americans plus having African American characters in children's young adult literature is still woefully low. And so I think what we're doing, what Brightside's doing, it's a step in the right direction. Each of us can do something.
Absolutely. Thank you both. We are going to try once more with the video from Brightside because we really want to get that message out and share their own words of why they found partnering with us so important. Unfortunately, it sounds like maybe we're still not getting audio. So we have shared that video link in the chat. We encourage you to go and check out that video and hear directly from them why they have partnered with us on this project. Dr. Rountree, as you're speaking about the importance of Black authors and Black story and all of that, I want to give a little bit of time for you to be able to share a little bit about the books that you have contributed to and the books that you've written. You shared in your bio that you've written a young adult novel, Lost Soul, but if you'd like to share at all about the literary works that you've written as well.
Oh, goodness. Okay, I wasn't ready for this. Okay, so let me think back. Well, I think, for example, the young adult novel Lost Soul was my first foray. Hopefully, I can have more, but into writing for children and young adults. It's speaking to, well, I should say the character is young African American girl growing up in Eastern North Carolina, big dreams of college and getting out of the state. So you can kind of say, semi-autobiographical, quite possibly. But also, really trying to negotiate that double consciousness, not only in spaces such as the classroom or at the time, the mall, okay, not as popular nowadays. But then also spaces even within African American spaces. Are you quote unquote Black enough? Are you fitting in? And so it has a lot of the kind of the angst, I would say, for young adults, but also with a very specific African American angle. For my articles, I would say I span African American culture. I do talk about film. For example, I've written on the film Get Out. Also literature as well, primarily African American women writers. That was my dissertation. It was focused on that. However, the chapter that really I found the most fascinating, which will not surprise you, was the chapter that was about African American children's and young adult literature. It's an interesting thing when we talk about agency and how much we can analyze and how far we've come with the canon. When I was working on my dissertation advisor did not want me to focus on children and young adult literature, even though obviously that's like a newer niche. And so that's why I ended up really focusing on African American women's Bills on Roman, which is basically coming of age novels. So, but once I was let loose and I had my freedom, I focused in on that. And so my two books are actually focusing, the first one on, I should say, how can I phrase it? African American writers who focus on female characters. So we were talking about issues of course, double consciousness, but also other issues. One of my favorites is called Ritual Grounds, which is something that's derived from a theorist named Robert Steptoe, where it talks about physical spaces that African Americans find themselves in that can be, well, they are dual. Oftentimes, just very simplistically positive and negative, whether we're talking about a classroom space, the church, we're talking about the barbershop, the beauty salon, all of these really, I should even say the kitchen, okay, in the house. So it's very powerful to look at those spaces and how African Americans interact with throughout those. I also focus on the role of education for African Americans in the place of that and the difficulties for young kids sometimes. In the other text, I'm focusing primarily more on African American boys. I felt like I was maybe kind of like a bookend of sorts. Mm-hmm. And in that one, many of the same elements I think I'm analyzing, but I do remember in particular one chapter that I focused on sports. A number of the texts written for boys, you can imagine, focus on, of course, football, but also basketball. And so that is a way of, or at that time in particular, African American boys looking at it as a way of moving up, upward mobility of sorts. So of course, we've always looked at the forms of entertainment, right, as that. But again, okay, so where's the place of education, from that perspective? So those are some of the elements that I'm looking at in those particular texts. So again, that's like one of my favorite areas, but also I have, analyzed African American women writers as well.
Great, thank you.
Absolutely.
Miss Guthrie, can you go back to, there we go. Miss Guthrie, I'd like to go back to, we're sharing about your experience of reading literature and engaging with Black literature. I'm curious about your experience with being aware of Black authors and Black stories as you were younger, and what it meant to you to see that sort of a reflection of yourself in literature, or to be able to engage with that, or if you didn't see that sort of representation, how that has impacted you as well.
I would say that I found a lot of representation when I was younger for non-fictional Black stories. So my parents, they have like these picture books. Like I had one for Sojourner Truth. I had one for Harriet Tubman. Actually, I had several for Harriet Tubman. Frederick Douglass, like all these different activists and important figures in Black history. But when it came to escapism or fiction, kind of like Dr. Rountree was saying earlier, how she gravitated toward Judy Blume and those kinds of texts, I also read those same books because I couldn't find any for young Black girls that were like of my age group. I feel like there's more of that out there now, but a lot of those genres have been dominated by authors of other backgrounds. Something that's been really on my mind quite a lot over the past year, as I look for a form of escapism, I've been gravitating a lot toward Afrofuturism, because with world events unfolding over the last year, I wanted to still read more from people whose perspectives were similar to my own, but I wasn't ready to read another slave narrative after, hearing about George Floyd or whatever. So I've really been on like an Afrofuturist kick, reading a lot of Octavia Butler. N.K. Jemisin is a more recent author, and I've been kind of reading every single thing she's written lately. I recently got Audible, and then I've been reading or listening to a couple texts on there. Some of those are more non-fictional, like The Black Elite, for instance, is a book that I'm listening to right now. And it's about like the upper class Black elite during the late 1800s. And that's something when in school we're kind of taught like Rockefeller, robber barons, and we're not really taught about the Black elite as much, and the intersection of class and race and those struggles. So I guess to answer your question, I'm like consuming as much media as I possibly can right now, because I didn't find that as much when I was younger, especially not in high school when I think I would have needed it most. But now I have the time and the resources to go and look up books, authors, and find things where I can feel myself reflected.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I want to dive into some of the questions from the audience. So one of the first was, what was the impact of white sponsors, publishers, or philanthropists who cultivated a taste or preference for certain types of Black-themed books? Dr. Rountree, can you dive into that one for us? And you're muted right now at the moment.
Particular time period, or like, are they talking about the gatekeepers, or I'm trying to kind of frame the question a little bit more.
And I'm not sure if the asker of the question can elaborate on that.
Well, I'll just jump in a little bit and give the person time to type. Definitely going back to the Harlem Renaissance. In particular, there were critics of writers from the Harlem Renaissance. For example, I remember when Ms. Guthrie brought up the point about Zora Neale Hurston, and you feel like sometimes, like in Their Eyes Are Watching God, some of the attributes that she held personally are not showing up in the text. One of the criticisms for some of the works for Hurston, and also for most people know Langston Hughes, of course, is that they had white benefactors. Remember, I was talking about during the Harlem Renaissance that, you know, we start to see a whole lot of new production. Well, guess what? The money oftentimes came from white benefactors, and at times, let's just say money talks and money can influence, right? Especially if that's where the artist is getting their daily bread of sorts. And so there were some elements of, well, I'll just say critiques of some of those works that maybe they were not as authentic as they could have been, or that some of the writers were not able to say exactly what they wanted to say or how much they wanted to say. If we're talking about gatekeepers in more contemporary times, I can speak a little bit more towards young adult and children's. As I was saying, the percentage, and I'm being very specific, the percentage of African American writers plus creating African American characters, because we have actually quite a high percentage of non-African Americans who will create and write for companies, you know, for children and young adults, and they have African American characters, or main characters, I should say. So I think the publishing industry, they see an opening, okay? They see where it can be lucrative, but there's still a hesitancy to bring on actual African Americans at times, to push, you know, I don't want to say agenda, but to really have their voices, you know, coming through. And so those are like two big ones I can think of. One more maybe is in the 70s, where I was talking about, you see an interesting pendulum swing, where publishers are really going after the African American woman's voice and perspective. And actually, that's when you have the Gloria Naylors, the Alice Walkers, Toni Morrisons, etc., really coming to the forefront, and they actually become the voice for African American literature. It becomes female, and it dominates really probably up until about maybe I would make an argument about the early 90s. So I'm not sure if I'm answering the question exactly, but those are at least three areas where I can see that.
Yeah, I think you did. The asker of the question posted the clarification that he was talking about the 1920s to 1950s, so the era before Toni Morrison and Alice Walker. And I think it leads directly into some of the next questions. The very next one was, what was the effect when Langston Hughes or Zora Neale Hurston wrote books that did not appeal to the white consumer?
I mean, you have pretty much what you'll see, I think, in like more contemporary times. There's, you know, a bit of a pushback of sorts. You know, I believe that text, literature, it's art. But I also believe, especially with African American literature, it's power for change as well. And so I think you have situations where writers, they actually face a certain level of compromise for a larger or broader good. And to have that, I think, as we were talking about, also Ms. Guthrie was talking about as well, to have that representation out there overall for the whole, I think that that's where you'll see some African American writers make that choice that, okay, so maybe I cannot put all of what I believe in there in the text, and that will hurt me artistically and internally to a certain extent. However, I think the ability to have that text, at the end of a Barnes and Noble's, aisle, can outweigh it, but there's a cost. And I think we have to be aware of that as well. I think in more contemporary terms, we see that arguably with the choices made by filmmakers as well. So that's kind of where I'm thinking and where I'm coming from with that
one. One of the things, Ms. Guthrie, that you brought up, just the fact essentially disappeared from the literary for Alice Walker. And that was one of the next questions, was she appear from the canon and die in poverty? No, lying unknown before Alice Walker. Looking at the edition of the book that's purchasable through Brightside, the quote from Alice Walker stating, "There's no book more important than this one." We see that sort of response for talking about her, but I think there is that important question of why she was so invisible before that resurgence. So that I will pose to either of you who want to speak on that.
I am not as well versed. To my knowledge, I feel like it had more to do with how she was perceived within the Black community at that time, because she kind of faded in popularity, and then yeah, I don't know. Dr. Rountree, can you elaborate a little bit more? I'm not the most well versed.
Oh, no, you're doing fine. But I couldn't hear the question exactly. Was it basically the importance of Zora's coming back, or why she disappeared? It was kind of digital. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it was more why she disappeared. So the question exactly was, why did she disappear from the literary canon and die in poverty and wind up unknown before Alice Walker resurrected her memory?
Gotcha. She definitely was, Ms. Guthrie is right. She was having a bit of a problem. There were about two things. One is more of a personal kind of, people were concerned about, let's just say, her dating life of sorts, and that sort of thing could become a little bit scandalous. But we're talking about the literature. She was also part of, as I mentioned earlier, the latter part of the Harlem Renaissance. And writers, There Is a Russian God was published in 1937. You had the rise, if you remember, I said the rise of Richard Wright. And he becomes the voice, okay, for African American letters, literature, etc. And he did not he was not fond of Harlem Renaissance writers, for one, because again, what I was talking about earlier, the notion of those the white sponsorship. He felt like they had compromised too much. They had given away too much about the Black struggle during the Harlem Renaissance so that they could have their parties, they could, etc. Okay, you get the idea. And you can imagine he was extremely vocal, all right, in literary circles, but not only within African American circles, but remember, he becomes very, very literate and powerful in other circles as well. And so, Zora is kind of relegated to the side and silenced. And we see that with a number of African American women writers, in particular during this time period. So then remember I said that there's this interesting pendulum swing that comes in the 70s. So you're seeing more publishers that are embracing, and I do believe it's reactionary to what was going with the Black arts movement. And they start really pushing forth the notion of the African American woman's voice, and it's selling. And that gave, an Alice Walker then the space to say, you know what, similar to what Ms. Guthrie mentioned and what I mentioned as well, she's like, where were the African American women writers when I was growing up and in college? We weren't studying them. And so she's going into that deep dive, and she discovers Zora, and it becomes something that is truly, it's almost like a kindred spirit. I'm trying to remember the term, foremother. She puts that for Zora. She is the foremother then of African American women writers, and it's just almost like it becomes, just coming together, where you have the rise of African American women writers, then you can have the power to resurge, the resurgence of someone who was silenced and buried.
Thank you both. And I apologize, Ms. Guthrie, I didn't mean to put you on the spot there, but you were certainly a bit more versed in that than even I was. So thank you for starting that question off. I want to get into a few more questions, and then we're going to wrap up. One of the next questions from the audience first was, there was a question, actually, Dr. Rountree, from someone wondering if you would be willing to share where to find your writing on the movie Get Out, because they find it a fascinating movie.
Oh, I'm still looking for a publisher. So I have a manuscript on it. I've actually presented the paper at several conferences. However, unfortunately, I don't think sometimes conferences will publish, the papers and that sort of thing. Those were not. But I'll be happy to, converse and share. So you have my email.
I'm sure we would love to hear that, and just a deeper dive into, I think it's a rising genre that we're starting to see now, is that I hate to call it just Black horror film, but the telling of traditional horror stories through the Black lens and the Black perspective is an interesting growing phenomenon that we're seeing now.
Well, can I jump really quick? I just wanted, with that, in that article, or I should say manuscript at this point, I'm actually analyzing Get Out, but I'm looking at the film Dutchman, which is basically a play written by Amiri Baraka, but they made it into a film, and there's so many interesting similarities. For those who are not familiar with Amiri Baraka, he's coming out of, guess what, Black arts movement, and Dutchman is a classic example of the Black arts movement, but many of the similar scenarios that we see in Get Out are happening in Dutchman. So I recommend, it's a little bit difficult to find, I think, nowadays, but if you like Get Out, I really highly recommend that you watch Dutchman, and you'll see a lot of connections between those.
Dr. Rountree, I actually wrote a paper about the Black arts movement last semester, and you can find the movie version of Dutchman on YouTube, like in its entirety, which is really awesome.
Finally. All right. Thank you for sharing that.
All right. One of the other questions that was asked by the audience was, what is the impact of political and economic trends that make some Black books popular and others not so well received? Does it depend on white consumers or having a big sponsor like Oprah Winfrey or Netflix to boost appeal?
Oh, that's a really great question. Well, I mean, we definitely witnessed in the last 20 or 30 years the power of Oprah. Okay, whether we're talking about any writer whatsoever. So I think that definitely having that that Oprah mark or a seal of approval of certain kinds definitely helps with the text. We also, with young adult and children's lit, we have the Coretta Scott King Award. Of course, we have Newbery, all these sorts of ones. All of those, yes, I think they definitely can help to elevate, the marketing ability of a particular author and a particular text. Political, well, yes. I mean, if we look at some texts Wow, I'm trying to think of a really good example. Um, for example, Baldwin, right now, he was celebrated during this time period as well, but he seems to be so much highly celebrated now in African American literature circles and beyond. I mean, even with documentary. But it seems like at that moment, right, certain writers can be seen as insinuatory, and that the texts are just too hot to handle, and so you're not going to be able to talk to the gatekeepers. You're not going to necessarily have a text being published by a quote unquote major publishing company. So yes, I do think there are definitely political and social times, or I should say aspects that will influence whether or not a particular writer is going to be celebrated and marketed properly.
Can I also jump in on this question?
Absolutely.
When I hear this question, I think kind of what texts my non-Black friends have consumed and like kind of the factors that go into that. So, for instance, The Hate U Give,
Mhm.
that was definitely a sensation. And there was a movie that was made, and I think it's now a trilogy. I know there are at least two books by that same author. And the number of times that non-Black people told me that I should go out and read this book because it was earth-shattering was kind of astounding to me. Um, and I think that the current political climate, when some people are ready to hear a more political message, then books like The Hate U Give, which is made, it's pretty readable. It's made for a young adult audience. So it's pretty accessible too. I think that those books can do really well. And then with things like the Oprah's Book Club, personally, I have mixed feelings because on the one hand, it does increase accessibility and visibility of these books, like I was saying earlier, because a casual reader can just kind of go down Oprah's list, and be introduced to these works and these authors that way. But I think at the same time, um, it still kind of panders to one almost whitewashed conception of what a Black narrative should be. So, like the more like speculative fiction is something that's kind of buried because it doesn't have like the poverty porn that, The Color Purple or Beloved, those kinds of things that non-Black audiences have come to associate with Black literature and the Black experience. And then even going into like Netflix adaptations of things like Dear White People, where the message has been kind of watered down to pander to a wider audience, or the life of Madam C.J. Walker. They created an entirely fictional character to act as an antagonist, when in real life, these two Black women were amazing entrepreneurs and juggernauts and created this whole industry of Black hair care and products. Like they weren't antagonistic in any way, and yet in this fictional adaptation of a real story, and I think there was like a book too, like a biography that the show was then based on. They just totally departed from all of that, and I think it's to cater to what people expect from these texts. So it's kind of interesting. I don't know. I just wanted to speak on that.
It's a really good point. Thank you both. We are going to wrap up this session, and I want to thank both of our speakers again for your insights, your just, I want to say brilliant examination of the importance of this subject. The way that you have prepared us for this series that we're about to embark on is, I think, absolutely invaluable. And we're so grateful for both of you for providing your insight and your knowledge and your experiences with reading literature, writing literature, examining literature, just diving into this focus on Black literature and that aspect of the lived Black experience. So we thank you both very much for being here this evening.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you. If we can pull the presentation. We also want to thank so much Brightside Book Shop for partnering with us in this project. Now is a time that more than ever, independent bookshops are so important to so many different things, not only local economy and local development, but also in a time like now when we're living through a pandemic and searching for methods of escaping the negativity that we're so often confronted with these days. Having a place where you can go and find a literary escape and just an escape into a meaningful story, a page of someone experiencing something in a completely different world, or maybe in a world that's exactly the same, and it's just putting your experience into words, is so important. We are eternally grateful to Brightside Book Shop for being willing to partner with us in this project, for seeing the importance of the Live Black Experience project that we're working on and these dialogues that we're engaging in with the community, and for being willing to partner with us in a way that is bringing us wider knowledge within the community and wider support. We encourage everyone who's watching with us to take a look at the book list. It was shared earlier in the chat, so if you scroll up through the comments on this thread, you'll see a full list of all of the books that are available for the series. There was also a link shared earlier, and we'll share it again, directly to Brightside Book Shop's page where they outline their partnership with us in this project. We encourage you to make your purchases of the books as part of this series through Brightside Book Shop, so that we can continue in this partnership and get these books out into the public and engage with each other in the conversation that we're going to have about these books and about this series. The next community dialogue that we'll be having is coming up on Sunday, March 14th, and it will be discussing the mistelling of the Kunta Kinte family horror, examining roots and its reimagining of the Middle Passage. So we encourage you to come back and join with us again as we engage in that session. As always, we want to remind you of what this project is all about. The Live Black Experience is dedicated to fully engaging the community in all aspects of the Live Black experience and facilitating community dialogues regarding it that lead to mutual understanding, respect, and reconciliation. We're housed in the historic Murdoch Community Center, which is located on the site of the old Dunbar Elementary School. Dunbar was desegregated almost 2 years prior to Brown versus the Board of Education, and the school system here was held up by the NAACP nationally as a model for education. By taking a few minutes to complete this survey, you're helping us to continue to provide the community with relevant and timely programming. So we thank you for your participation with the survey as well. And if you enjoy the programming that's brought to you by the Murdoch Community Center, we ask you to consider helping us to continue the work with a monetary donation. You can do so by going to the link below or scanning the QR code to make a donation to this ongoing work. And with that, we thank you all again for joining us. We are so appreciative for everyone who joins with us week after week to engage in this ongoing conversation about the Black lived experience and its contribution to the American story and the broader story of the Flagstaff community of Arizona and our nation. We encourage you to continue participating with us, to read with us, to watch with us, to engage in conversation. Keep asking your questions, because without your participation, we're only talking to ourselves, and we want to continue engaging with you and hear your voices and see a broadening of understanding within the fuller conversation. So we thank you. We wish you all a wonderful evening. We look forward to seeing you next time. And with that, we'll say good night.